Tonight, as the world hushes around us, we slip back to a time when candles were currency, baths were seasonal, and poetry was considered foreplay. The cobbled streets of Elizabethan England stretch ahead, damp, smoky, and full of people speaking in iambic pentameter, like it was a group chat they couldn't leave. We're visiting the life of a man whose words still echo through classrooms, coffee mugs, and wildly misquoted Instagram captions. William Shakespeare, playwright, poet, and occasional inventor of phrases that now haunt middle schoolers everywhere. But tonight, you're not here for homework. You're here to be lulled, to let language drape over you like a velvet curtain, slightly moth-eaten, deeply theatrical. We'll wander through foggy alleys, into rickety theatres, and eventually to a writing desk where a man once stared into the void and thought, yes, let's make the ghost talk. Before we settle too deep, feel free to like the video and subscribe if the quiet suits you. And if you feel like it, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all lying in separate beds, mutually ignoring reality together. The year was 1564, and in the quaint, suspiciously draughty town of Stratford-upon-Avon, a boy was born into a house that smelled faintly of tanned leather, wood smoke, and whatever the neighbours had been boiling for 3 days straight. His name was William Shakespeare, though at the time he was mostly known for crying on a schedule and being the third child of John Shakespeare and Mary Arden, two names that sounded important enough to impress the church records. Stratford was the kind of place where gossip travelled faster than the plague, and timber-framed houses leaned into each other like conspirators. It was not a glamorous town, but it had charm. If your idea of charm included mud-slicked lanes, goose feathers in the street, and the soft threat of typhoid. William's father, John, was a glover and a local merchant, which meant he spent his days elbow-deep in animal skins, curing hides and selling them with the flourish of a man who thought a particularly soft goat leather could solve most social problems. Mary Arden, William's mother, came from old farming stock, respectable, hard-working, and the sort of lineage that could churn butter in their sleep. Together, they built a household both modest and filled with the gentle chaos of multiple children, seasonal colds, and an eternal battle between soot and clean laundry. Childhood in Stratford was a mixture of bucolic serenity and the kind of hygiene practices that would make a dermatologist weep. Young William likely wandered through the wildflower-speckled fields and along the banks of the River Avon, which shimmered beautifully in the sun and smelled vaguely like yesterday's fish. He probably chased birds, climbed trees, and, like every child with too much imagination and not enough supervision, occasionally tried to eat something that wasn't food. In the midst of all this pastoral freedom was education, yes, even in the 16th century, the dream of being trapped at a desk was alive and well. William attended the King's New School, a grammar institution where boys were taught Latin, rhetoric, and how to survive a 9-hour school day with nothing but dry bread, ink-stained fingers, and a vague sense of dread. The classroom was strict, Spartan, and profoundly unsanitized. Lessons were chanted aloud in unison, as if volume might replace comprehension. Boys scratched out translations of Ovid and Seneca with quills that splintered just when inspiration struck. The wooden benches were just comfortable enough to delay scoliosis by a decade, and the punishments, often involving canes and dramatic sighs, ensured discipline by way of light trauma. And yet, in this dimly lit crucible of conjugations and cold toes, something in William took root. The ancient Roman texts, filled with tragic fates, scheming gods, and overly poetic death scenes, fed the flickers of a theatrical mind. These stories weren't just academic fodder, they were blueprints for the kind of drama he would one day unleash on the world. Affairs, murders, mistaken identities, and conveniently timed sword fights. Sort of like modern reality TV, but in verse. The school itself stood near the heart of town. its halls echoing with boys reciting lines none of them understood, under the watchful eyes of teachers who may or may not have enjoyed inflicting minor existential crises. But William endured it, absorbed it, and somehow, through the repetition, the classics, and the smell of damp wood and old parchment, he found a rhythm. By the time he was in his teens, he had internalized the architecture of a good story, one with conflict, consequence, and characters bold enough to monologue through their breakdowns, and all before the age when most modern teenagers are just figuring out how to file a tax return or apply eyeliner without summoning a demon. So there he was, a glovemaker's son in a town full of cows, sermons, and secret grudges, soaking in the world with an eye for detail and a brain built like a stage. Not yet a playwright, not yet a legend, just a curious boy surrounded by riverbanks, Latin verbs, and enough small-town drama to make an Elizabethan soap opera. And just like that, the curtain quietly rises. By the age of 18, William Shakespeare had acquired all the key ingredients for an Elizabethan coming-of-age arc, a respectable education, a sharp imagination, and a very sudden marriage. The year was 1582. William, still very much a teenager by modern standards, married Anne Hathaway, not the one you're thinking of, though this Anne was also poised, enigmatic, and more than capable of managing her own narrative. She was 8 years his senior, a farmer's daughter from nearby Shottery, and likely possessed the kind of practical intelligence that can outlast both droughts and poets. The circumstances surrounding their union were, how shall we put this, hastened. Anne was pregnant at the time, which in Tudor England meant two things: swift vows and a great deal of whispered speculation. The wedding was held quietly, likely in a local church, with minimal fanfare and maximum side-eye from neighbours who specialised in timeline math. Marriage in the 16th century was not about romance or compatibility. It was about land, lineage, and the faint hope that both parties would survive the winter. Love, if it came at all, was usually wedged somewhere between livestock negotiations and shared disappointment, and yet something about their life together worked, perhaps because Anne had the temperament of a woman who could run a household, raise 3 children, and tolerate a husband who would soon abandon tanning oil for quill ink. Their first daughter, Susanna, arrived in May of 1583, just 6 months after the wedding. This caused exactly as much surprise as you'd imagine in a town where everyone knew exactly how long gestation took and had calendars carved into their walls. Still, Susanna was healthy, which was a minor miracle in a world where children regularly succumbed to air, water, or mysterious ills labelled humours. 2 years later, Anne gave birth to twins, Hamnet and Jew. Death. A bold move. Twins were often seen as either a blessing or an omen, depending on your mood and access to fresh water. The naming convention was curious too: Hamnet, which sounds like a ham sandwich in a bonnet, and Judith, which had all the reliable firmness of a woolen church pew. Life with 3 children under the age of 5 was no easier then than now. Except in this version, there were no nappies, no wet wipes, and no multivitamin gummies shaped like woodland creatures. The house would have been filled with crying, clanging, the distant hum of livestock, and the looming fear of childhood illness that always hovered like a judgmental relative. William, for his part, likely oscillated between fatherly affection and the unspoken urge to go somewhere else. Not uncommon for men of the period, who often expressed devotion by writing letters from a different county. In his case, London would soon beckon with its theatres, taverns, and slightly less immediate diapering duties. Anne remained in Stratford, anchoring the household, while William's ambitions began to expand beyond the reach of the Avon. She managed the estate, raised the children, and likely cultivated the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing you married a man who might become famous, or at the very least peculiar. Marriage, then, was a partnership of necessity, forged in haste but held by something sturdier than sentiment. There is no record of grand gestures or love sonnets addressed to Anne. But then again, the man wrote tragedies for a living. he may have reserved his emotional outbursts for the stage and his real affection for well-managed property taxes. Still, this brief chapter in Stratford was foundational. It marked the moment when William moved from potential to responsibility. A wife, children, the vague scent of barley porridge always lingering in the corners of the house. It was a life both ordinary and quietly extraordinary, the way all beginnings are before anyone realizes what they've begun. And in that modest home, nestled between the river and the gossip, the seeds of something far greater were quietly planted, waiting for the day he'd leave town and rewrite the world with ink. By the early 1590s, the house in Stratford was humming with the sounds of 3 children, a quietly efficient wife, and a husband who was beginning to spend rather a lot of time not at home. William Shakespeare, now in his 20s, did what many creatively frustrated men have done throughout history. He moved to the city to follow his dreams and avoid changing diapers. London, crowded, chaotic, and fragrantly medieval, was calling, and William, ever the poet, answered with luggage in one hand and a pocket full of ambition in the other. London at the time was an unwashed tangle of opportunity and plague rats. It was the kind of city where fortunes were made, lost, and pickpocketed in a single afternoon. Theatre was booming, partly because it gave the people something to do between outbreaks of disease, and partly because human beings have always enjoyed watching other people suffer dramatically while wearing tights. William quickly embedded himself in the theatrical world, joining a company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which sounds like a fraternity for dramatic aristocrats, but was in fact a reputable acting troupe. They later became the King's Men. Once a royal patron decided their sword fights and monologues were worth a title upgrade, much like getting verified on social media but with more codpieces. He began as an actor, taking small roles in modest productions, all while quietly feeding lines to the stage like a man who couldn't resist editing reality itself. His acting skills were adequate. He rarely played leads, which may have been due to talent, or possibly just a face better suited to writing than spotlight. Still, his performances were competent, and more importantly, they kept him close to the stage, the living heartbeat of Elizabethan drama. It wasn't long before his true gift became impossible to ignore. William could write, not in the ordinary ICE and pen a shopping list sort of way, but in the alarming, this man just invented new words and convinced us they've always existed kind of way. His early plays hit the stage with a kind of unfiltered intensity, histories soaked in blood, tragedies heavy with betrayal, and comedies where everyone fell in love with the wrong person, as tradition requires. Audiences adored it. They packed into cramped wooden theatres, standing shoulder to shoulder in what was essentially a Renaissance mosh pit, all to watch the rise and fall of kings, the wails of scorned lovers, and the occasional cross-dressing noble with excellent comic timing. Performances were held during daylight hours, and the scent of the crowd, sweat, ale, and a pinch of existential dread, was likely thick enough to taste. William wrote fast, possibly too fast, but quality wasn't sacrificed. Each line was coiled with metaphor, each insult artful enough to qualify as poetry. He had a knack for capturing the absurdity of the human condition, which conveniently had changed very little since ancient Rome. Lust, pride, poor decisions, timeless content, really. By the mid-1590s, Shakespeare was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. His plays were earning money, praise, and enough notoriety that even the nobility started quoting him. And in Elizabethan society, nothing screamed status like having your joke stolen by someone with a title and a hat shaped like a wedding cake. Despite his success, William remained tethered to Stratford in quiet ways. Letters sent, visits made, investments in property. But London was now his stage, a place where plague and poetry waltzed arm in arm, where actors lived by applause and ale, and where a glovemaker's son could become a voice for generations. And so, Under smoky skies and creaking rafters, Shakespeare's career began not with a bang, but with the rustle of parchment, the slap of sandals on wet cobblestones, and a story waiting to be told. Success in London brought with it certain luxuries, chief among them the ability to invest in large wooden circles designed to contain shouting actors and unpredictable audiences. By the turn of the 17th century, William Shakespeare was no longer just writing for the theatre. He was owning it. In 1599, along with his theatrical colleagues, William co-founded the Globe Theatre, a round, open-air monument to drama, discomfort, and the enduring belief that yelling poetry at strangers could be a viable business model. Constructed on the south bank of the River Thames, the Globe was assembled using repurposed timber from an older theatre they had, quite literally, stolen in the dead of night, a kind of Elizabethan start-up launch, but with fewer lanterns and significantly more splinters. The Globe was a marvel of its kind. 3 tiers of galleries wrapped around a central yard where the common folk, or groundlings, stood packed together like sweaty sardines, paying a single penny for the privilege of standing through a 3-hour performance and potentially catching plague via eye contact. These were the true connoisseurs of theatre, showing appreciation through loud cheers, occasional heckling, and, if displeased, hurling the Elizabethan equivalent of a tomato, whatever happened to be in their lunch. For a playwright, the Globe was a dream. For an actor, it was a mildly dangerous platform perched above a swarm of strangers, held together by ambition, thatch, and a general disregard for fire codes. Here, some of Shakespeare's most beloved works took the stage. Romeo and Juliet, a cautionary tale about hormones, terrible communication, and the dangers of dating someone whose entire personality is star-crossed. A Midsummer Night's Dream, filled with enchanted forests, love potions, and a man who briefly has a donkey's head. A plot line only slightly more confusing than your other. Age dating app encounter. And The Merchant of Venice, a story full of moral complexity, strange contracts, and a courtroom scene that makes modern law seem surprisingly chill. These plays were not simply performed, they were lived. Actors strutted, whispered, died dramatically, and occasionally forgot their lines under the crushing pressure of 3,000 eyes, half of whom were there mostly because public executions had been postponed. The Globe allowed Shakespeare's words to bloom in full voice. It was theatre in its most visceral form, sunlight pouring onto the stage, birds interrupting monologues, and the distant scent of roasted meat mingling with metaphor. There were no microphones, no stage lights, and certainly no understudies waiting in the wings with perfect brows and backup headshots. If someone forgot their cue, the entire building knew it, and likely applauded anyway. Despite the limitations, or perhaps because of them, the experience was immersive. The plays weren't distant performances, they were social events, communal dreams projected from the stage into the minds of those watching, leaning forward, hands sticky from pears or spilled ale, eyes wide. Shakespeare's partnership in the Globe also meant something rare for an artist of his time: financial stability. A portion of the profits came to him, which he used wisely, investing in property, land, and, presumably, avoiding the temptation to buy 400 lace collars, just in case. It allowed him to write freely, think deeply, and avoid the fate of many fellow writers who spent their lives penning brilliant works only to be paid in compliments and mouldy cheese. The Globe became more than just a building. It was a crucible for ideas, a mirror to society, and a place where kings and fools alike found voice. And in the heart of it all, William stood quietly, pen in hand, eyes on the crowd, and mind already drifting toward the next tale. In the low hum of applause, in the creak of floorboards and flicker of candlelight, the theatre breathed, and so did he. By the early 1600s, Shakespeare's pen had tasted success, laughter, and enough applause to gently inflate any playwright's ego. But something began to shift in his writing. a quiet turning inward, like the changing of seasons, or the creeping realization that no one was ever going to clean the chamber pot. His comedies had brought joy, his histories grandeur, but now the stage darkened. What followed was a sequence of plays so emotionally heavy and philosophically rich they could bend time itself, or at least make 3 hours feel like a contemplative eternity. These were the tragedies, works in which nobody lived happily ever after, and most didn't live at all. It began with Hamlet, a play about indecision, grief, ghosts, and what happens when you think too much and act too late. The Danish prince was not the type to storm castles, more the type to stand by the curtains, overanalyze life, and deliver existential monologues so relatable they may as well have been captioned under a brooding selfie. To be or not to be wasn't just a question, it was a vibe. Then came King Lear, an aging monarch who divided his kingdom based on how well his daughters complemented him, a bold leadership strategy that somehow failed spectacularly. What followed was betrayal, madness, and wandering through storms in dramatic robes while shouting about fate, a reminder that retirement planning, even in the 17th century, could be a complete disaster. And then Macbeth, a tale of vaulting ambition, whispered prophecy, and the worst couples project in theatrical history. Macbeth starts with noble intentions and ends with murder, hallucinations, and a wife who turns hand-washing into a full-body spiritual crisis. The lesson: if 3 witches offer vague career advice, maybe get a second opinion. These plays were bleaker, sharper, and somehow more intimate. They stripped characters to their bones, peeled away power, vanity, and pride, until only trembling humanity remained. Ambition was punished, madness was contagious, and fate, like a strict landlord, always came knocking. The tragedies marked Shakespeare's deeper exploration into morality, not in the sanitized, church-approved sense, but in the unsettling late-night thought spiral way. What does it mean to be good? How much suffering can we cause while still believing we're right? Why does everyone in power seem just a little too confident? Audiences were entranced. Some came for the poetry, others possibly for the satisfying predictability that by Act 5 at least 5 people would be dead, and at least one of them would be stabbed dramatically mid-sentence. The Globe became a cathedral of catharsis. Viewers wept, gasped, and occasionally fainted, not from emotion but from the heat and the tightness of their corsets. These works also gave actors something delicious to do. Mad scenes, grief speeches, sword fights where everyone took turns dying with increasing elegance. In a time when men wore starched ruffs and makeup made from lead, a slow onstage death was one of the few opportunities to really let loose. And yet, despite the blood and despair, these tragedies whispered something oddly comforting, that life was chaotic, that humans were flawed, that power was fragile, and sometimes being a mess was the most honest thing a person could be. It was philosophy and poetry, dressed up in revenge and treason. As Shakespeare penned these darker plays, something about the world itself seemed to echo back. The Elizabethan era was waning, shadows were lengthening, and even the theatre began to feel like a place not just for entertainment, but for reckoning. And so, under candlelight and thunderous silence, the tragedies arrived, each one a mirror, cracked and glinting, not to terrify but to remind that even in madness there is meaning, and in downfall something strangely beautiful. After decades spent tangled in stage curtains and royal intrigue, William Shakespeare did what many successful professionals eventually fantasize about. He quietly backed away from his desk and moved out of the city. Around 1610, he returned to Stratford-upon-Avon, the town where wildflowers bloomed in hedgerows, gossip grew like ivy, and nobody ever quite forgot what you did at age 18. It was a soft retreat, not with fanfare, but with a kind of poetic withdrawal. London had been exhilarating, exhausting, and profoundly unbathed. It was time for something slower, quieter, slightly less plague-adjacent. By this point, William had accumulated not just fame, but something far more satisfying, land ownership. In true poet-turned-property mogul fashion, he purchased New Place, the second largest house in Stratford, a house so grand it had 10 fireplaces, several staircases, and more rooms than most Tudor marriages had affection. Naturally, this caused a bit of a stir in the neighbourhood. Nothing says I've made it quite like adding another wing while your neighbour's roof is still made of straw and regrets. From the outside it might have looked like a retirement, but within those timbered walls his mind was still staging entire kingdoms. His later plays, The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, shifted away from vengeance and tragedy and into something else entirely. They whispered of forgiveness, time, and redemption, as if his quill, once sharp as a dagger, had learned the value of gentleness. The Tempest, in particular, felt like a farewell, a story about a man who gives up power, lets go of the past, and literally drowns his magic book. Subtle, it was not. But then again, subtlety has never been the preferred method of a man who once killed off a character with a bear and got away with it. These final works softened the edges. Fathers made peace with daughters. Nemesis embraced. Lost children were found, usually just in time to marry someone socially acceptable. Even time itself, normally cruel and linear, seemed in these plays to bend kindly towards second chances. There's something quietly astonishing about that a man who spent so many years inventing spectacular deaths now turned his attention to grace, as though age had loosened the grip of ambition and replaced it with reflection. Or perhaps he'd simply grown tired of orchestrating onstage poisonings and wanted to write a nice wedding scene where no one passed out. In Stratford his days slowed. He walked the same lanes he once wandered as a boy, now with more coin in his pocket and less patience for cold pews. He spent time with family, attended church, and likely endured local flattery with the mild discomfort of someone who'd been mythologized while still alive. Retirement in the early 1600s did not mean leisure as we know it. There were no cruises, no scented bath bombs, and certainly no ergonomic furniture. But there was peace, familiarity, and just enough time to set one's affairs in order before the final curtain. In April of 1616, William's life drew quietly to its close. He died at age 52 in the town where he had been born, and where the River Avon still moved slowly through fields and memory. He was buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church under a slab of stone etched with a warning against moving his bones, a poetic threat, gently passive-aggressive and deeply on brand. He left behind words, thousands of them, some whispered, some thundered, some so beautifully crafted that they still hum in the mouths of strangers centuries later. And though the stage fell silent, his presence remained, woven into the boards, the breath, the hush before the line. On April 23rd, 1616, his supposed birthday because Shakespeare was nothing if not committed to narrative symmetry, William quietly left the world he had so artfully mirrored. He died at 52, which in Elizabethan terms was roughly equivalent to reaching level 99 in a video game on hardcore mode. He had survived plague, bad dental hygiene, and decades of theatrical stress. Not bad for a man who spent his life poking fun at kings and inventing elaborate death scenes for imaginary people. His final days were spent in Stratford-upon-Avon, in the large house called New Place, where he had retreated after a career filled with crowds, candles, and creative pressure. There's no dramatic record of his passing, no thunderstorm, no monologue, no theatrical collapse at centre stage. Just the quiet hush of a life complete. He was buried in Holy Trinity Church, not far from the font where he had been baptized. His gravestone bore a warning, delivered in the form of a light curse. advising grave robbers to kindly keep their hands off his bones, a reasonable request, especially in a time when digging up corpses for scientific curiosity was considered a mildly eccentric hobby. But Shakespeare's body was only one part of the equation. His words, those restless, layered, lovingly chaotic words, were still scattered across London in actors' trunks, scribbled scripts, and memory. 7 years later, in 1623, two of his fellow actors and friends, John Hemingers and Henry Condell, decided to gather the pieces. With the kind of meticulous dedication usually reserved for wedding planners and conspiracy theorists, they compiled what became known as the First Folio, a weighty book of 36 plays, carefully preserved for the ages. It was an act of archival brilliance and emotional devotion. Without it, half of his plays, including Macbeth, Twelfth Night, and Julius Caesar, might have vanished completely. Lost, forever to time, mildew, or someone using them to wrap fish at the market. The First Folio was expensive, grand, and deeply impractical to read in bed. It grouped the plays into comedies, histories, and tragedies, which is roughly the Elizabethan version of mood playlists, and in doing so it ensured that Shakespeare's works didn't just survive, they endured, whispered in candlelit corners, shouted in crowded classrooms, tattooed on theatre majors in Latin for some reason. His legacy strangely wasn't immediate. There was no instant cult of celebrity, no street named after him, no candle brand called Ye Old Melancholy Sonnet. But his influence began to grow, like ivy on a forgotten wall, quiet, persistent, impossible to uproot. Actors took up his lines, scholars debated his meaning, teenagers everywhere were eventually forced to annotate Romeo and Juliet, quietly wondering how two people could fall so deeply in love before even exchanging surnames. Over time, he became a pillar, not just of literature, but of language itself. Expressions we now consider common: break the ice, wild goose chase, wear your heart on your sleeve, were gifts from his pen. He reshaped English the way a sculptor reshapes stone, with elegance, force, and the occasional unnecessary flourish. But perhaps his greatest trick wasn't what he wrote. It was how true it all felt. His characters, though dressed in ruffs and making dramatic speeches about moons and daggers, felt oddly familiar. Their flaws were ours, their dreams equally ridiculous, their suffering beautifully staged. And so, long after the stage lights dimmed and the ink dried, Shakespeare's voice remained, not as a ghost, though he'd have enjoyed that, but as a whisper carried from page to stage, from sleep to story. In the end, he didn't just leave a legacy, he authored one, bound in folios, echoed in classrooms, murmured through lullabies like this one, and with every word still read aloud, every role still performed, he lives again. Shakespeare may have been buried beneath a stone slab with a politely threatening epitaph, but his words simply refused to stay put. In the centuries that followed, his influence unfolded quietly, like ivy creeping across a cathedral wall, or like glitter from a birthday card, impossible to fully remove. His impact wasn't limited to theatre or literature. It rewired the English language itself, which, to be fair, was in desperate need of a stylist at the time. He added over 1,700 words to the English vocabulary, not borrowed, not inherited, created, as if language were his personal sandbox and everyone else was just playing with his toys. Some were dramatic, assassination, lonely, majestic. Others, suspiciously casual, bedroom swagger, fashionable. One can only imagine him inventing eyeball and pausing mid-quill to think, yes, this will do nicely. His phrases became part of everyday speech, slipped into conversation like a seasoning no one questions. Break the ice, green-eyed monster, wild goose chase. It's Greek to me. He had a flair for capturing the odd little truths of human life, jealousy, confusion, ambition, and giving them names that stuck. Some phrases became so familiar that their poetic origins were forgotten entirely, like using a famous painting as a coaster. But it wasn't just about vocabulary, it was about themes, the quiet currents beneath the words. Love, power, betrayal, death, identity, regret, repeated across centuries, like history, with better costumes. His characters weren't cardboard monarchs or stock jesters. They were gloriously flawed people, caught between what they wanted and what the world allowed. We still recognize them. The indecisive intellectual Hamlet, the charismatic manipulator, Iago, the naive romantic, Romeo, the spiraling power couple who really should have gone to therapy, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. They may have worn ruffs and soliloquized to skulls, but their inner lives remain painfully modern. And because of that, his work continues to mutate, adapting to each generation's taste in drama, costume design, and attention span. Shakespeare has been performed in palaces, parking lots, subway stations, and space-themed high schools. He's been translated into every major language, and quite a few minor ones, including Klingon, because apparently even intergalactic warlords enjoy poetic vengeance. His plays have been turned into ballets, operas, rom-coms, and revenge thrillers. The Lion King is essentially Hamlet with better fur. 10 Things I Hate About You is the taming of the shrew, minus the threat of starvation as a relationship tool. And Macbeth? Let's just say any modern political drama where someone says, "I'd kill for that position," is quietly nodding in his direction. There's something resilient about Shakespeare's stories. They thrive in candlelight, but they survive under LED bulbs too. You can dress Twelfth Night in denim, set Julius Caesar in a boardroom, or perform The Tempest underwater. It still works. The human heart doesn't change much, even if the hairstyles do. And of course, there's the strange comfort of knowing that our most chaotic thoughts, love at first sight, fear of failure, existential dread at 3 a.m., have been elegantly dramatized for over 400 years. Shakespeare reminds us that we're not original, and somehow that's liberating. His plays continue to be studied, quoted, reimagined, and yes, dreaded by students everywhere. But whether you're asleep in a theatre seat or just listening now, eyes growing heavy, the words find their way in, not because they're ancient, but because they're alive. And in every whispered soliloquy, every carefully botched quote, every midnight monologue muttered in a mirror, he returns, smirking faintly as if to say, "Told you so." And so we arrive not at an end, but at something quieter, a sort of echo that never quite fades. Shakespeare's legacy did not close with the first folio or the final curtain call. It simply shifted, as all great stories do, into something larger than its author. Because the true marvel wasn't just what he wrote, but how universally it lingered. In his time, the theatre was one of the few places where everyone, from perfumed nobles in velvet seats to rowdy groundlings clutching meat pies, stood side by side in shared awe. A muddy democracy of distraction. There were no velvet ropes separating rich from poor in understanding love, loss, or the particular horror of being mistaken for someone else while in disguise. Shakespeare's characters belonged to no one and to everyone. They wore crowns or rags, but they bled the same. His plays were a mirror, held up not just to kings, but to all of us, reflecting every clumsy ambition, every bruised ego, every ill-timed declaration of love shouted across a balcony. And somehow, this strange Elizabethan mirror kept working long after the roughs were retired and the leeches were finally discredited as medical tools. What he wrote was specific, yet entirely portable. His tragedies mourned the fall of ancient heroes, yet felt uncannily similar to a modern Tuesday. His comedies danced through forests and mistaken identities with the energy of a poorly planned group vacation. His histories rewrote kings into men with bad tempers and worse advisors. If humanity had a user manual, his plays might be wedged inside, right after the confusing part about emotions. And though the world around his words has changed, our technology, our pace, our skincare routines, what beats at the heart of them remains constant. We still wrestle with power, still misread each other's intentions, still ruin perfectly good relationships out of pride or poorly timed solace. Eloquias typed in all caps. Shakespeare knew how ridiculous we were. He also knew how beautiful. It's this contradiction, this balance of absurdity and grace, that makes his work feel not just timeless, but tender. One moment we're watching a king unravel from guilt, the next we're watching a man fall in love with a stranger in under 10 seconds, because she had great hair and a moderately poetic name. This is the strange truth of humanity. Tragedy wears perfume, and love often shows up in disguise. His words don't belong to an era. They belong to the unspoken moments between people. The glance held too long, the sentence regretted immediately, the realization, far too late, that we've been wrong. And that's why his work keeps returning, on stages and screens, in classrooms and whispered bedtime readings. His characters walk with us now, disguised perhaps, but intact. Lady Macbeth scrolls through job listings. Hamlet sulks into a coffee shop. Juliet texts someone she probably shouldn't. The settings shift, but the soul stays the same. Shakespeare's legacy isn't marble statues or academic papers, though there are plenty of those, gathering dust and reverence. It's something subtler, a flicker in the voice when reading aloud, a stillness before a line lands, a story told again. He left us with more than just language. He left us with a way of seeing, an invitation to laugh at ourselves, question our motives, and maybe, just maybe, forgive each other in the third act. In the end, he gave us not just stories, but shelter, a place to sit beside kings and fools, to lose ourselves in iambic dreams, and to remember that we are not alone in our longing. And in this hush, this pause before the credits, we close the book, not because it ends, but because it waits, softly, patiently, ready to begin again. And now, with the stage long empty and the crowd quietly gone, we find him again, not in a theatre or a library, but walking a slow path through the English countryside, where the hedges grow wild and the air smells faintly of earth, smoke, and things long unsaid. It's spring in Stratford-upon-Avon, though it could just as well be any season in any century. Shakespeare walks beneath a sky wide enough to hold all his unwritten ideas. His boots are dusty, his coat a little threadbare at the elbows. He is no longer the man of London stages or royal commissions, just a figure strolling past sheep who have never seen a tragedy and frankly would prefer it that way. Here, his mind wanders as easily as the river beside him. He watches leaves fall and thinks of kings losing power. He hears birdsong and thinks of fairies bickering over love potions. Every detail becomes a doorway, every sound a suggestion. This is what creation looks like when no one is watching, a man quietly rearranging the world in his head. Behind him, Stratford remains gently unimpressed. It's a town that measures time not in revolutions but in harvests, where legacies are weighed alongside winter preserves and gossip about who's been seen walking home with whom. His large house, new place, sits with shutters half drawn, waiting for a man who is always nearby but rarely still. There is something deeply unglamorous about genius in its natural habitat. No laurel wreath, no quill dramatically poised in moonlight. Just an aging playwright gently scolding a bee from his collar while mentally outlining a storm scene. Creation, it turns out, is less lightning bolt and more low hum. And yet the words remain. They flutter through this landscape, invisible but persistent, like pollen in the air, or that one song you can't get out of your head, even though it came out 3 centuries too late. The stories live on, no. Not because they are perfect, but because they are true in the ways that matter. Vulnerable, ridiculous, achingly human. So much of Shakespeare's world was unpleasantly textured. corsets tight enough to restrict judgment, medicine consisting of equal parts guesswork and herbs you definitely shouldn't eat, people applying lead to their faces while declaring it made them radiant as their eyebrows quietly left the building. And yet somehow, in all that discomfort, he found something enduring, something that feels, still, like a whispered secret meant just for you. Perhaps it's not even about the plays anymore, not really. It's about what they did, how they slipped past the noise of the world and reached for the quiet part of us, the part that knows longing without words, the part that stares out windows and invents entire scenes with no audience at all. That's the gift, not fame, not applause, but this, the space between breath and story, the soft moment when words become shelter. And maybe that's where we leave him, not standing triumphant on a stage, but walking gently between hedgerows, the last light of evening catching on his sleeve. Behind him, the murmur of a world he once captured in ink. Ahead, the slow hush of twilight and the knowledge that somewhere someone is still listening, you, perhaps. So sleep now, with the knowledge that stories outlive their tellers, and in the silence between lines, the playwright still walks, whistling softly, utterly ordinary and entirely eternal. And now the tale is told. The curtain falls, not with a roar, but with the rustle of parchment, the soft shuffle of slippers down a candlelit hallway, and the distant creak of an Elizabethan floorboard that's probably older than most modern countries. Shakespeare has walked off stage, the ink has dried, the quills are sleeping, and here you are, still drifting in the quiet afterglow, with language lingering like the scent of old wood smoke on wool. It's a good place to be, the space just after story, where the mind softens its grip and the world stops asking questions. You've wandered through London fog and Stratford fields, past thunderous applause, tragic deaths, suspiciously poetic ghosts, and romance so impulsive it would make a dating app blush. You've met kings and clowns, witches and warriors, and quite a few people who are entirely too confident in their disguise-based schemes. And somehow, even after all that spectacle, the greatest gift was still the silence underneath it all. This is where sleep belongs, in the pause between acts, in the breath between lines. Shakespeare knew this. He understood that even the most eloquent character must eventually run out of things to say, and when they do, there is peace. So now you're invited to follow him past the last page, beyond the flickering candle, into the hush. Imagine the world slowing around you, the sky dimming into a velvet hush, the night stretching its limbs like a bored cat on a sun-warmed sill. The troubles of the day, emails, errands, your unresolved existential crisis about laundry, all quietly stepping aside like overly dramatic extras leaving the stage. Even the absurdities we mock become strangely soft in the dark. The uncomfortable corsets, the lead-based makeup, the wildly impractical fashion choices that made every noble look like a disgruntled pastry. Funny, yes, but distant now, harmless, as if history itself has been tucked in. You've spent these chapters in a story larger than one man. It was about him, yes, but also about the strange persistence of art, the way words outlive empires, the way a glovemaker's son could write his way into the marrow of culture, not by being perfect, but by being honest. And now you carry it, quietly, into rest, like a phrase tucked behind your thoughts, like a rhythm echoing beneath the hum of dreams. So breathe gently. There's nothing left to solve here, no tragic turn to brace for, no plot twist in the final seconds, just the steady rhythm of sleep arriving, slow, certain, unapologetically overdue. Let the stage grow dim, let the thoughts fold in, and let yourself fall, not with drama, not with fear, but with ease, with the soft weight of story still resting on your chest like a woolen cloak warmed by fire. This is your epilogue now. No need to speak it aloud, just live it. And as the night deepens and your breath softens, may you dream in verse, strange, lovely, and just a little bit ridiculous, like a man with a feather in his cap and far too much to say. Good night, traveller of tales. You've earned the silence. Let it begin.